Today's video is brought to you by Surfshark VPN. Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today, I'm moving into slightly uncomfortable territory as I'm responding to a video by one of the channels that I watched for atheist-themed content before I got into making videos myself, Armoured Skeptic. He seems to have pivoted mainly to making videos that spread conspiracy theory garbage. Like, he's trying to both sides it, giving himself a bit of plausible deniability, but when presenting the side that is supposed to be skeptical of the conspiracy theory, he gives it the weakest possible defense, seeming to default back to, but we have good reason to be skeptical of the official story territory, without actually fully presenting the official story. Now, I have heard a defense of his History is a Lie series being him playing a character. It's not really him presenting what he believes, he's pretending to be accepting the conspiracy stuff for the purposes of entertainment, I guess. Apparently he did explicitly state this in the first video in the series. Well, as pathetic as the Alex Jones defense is, I actually do want to present his side of things in the best possible light, so I watched the first video in the series as well as this one. And nowhere does he say that this is him playing a character. The closest he comes to that is the opening of the video saying that he's just trying to have fun, and then saying, remember guys, this is just for fun at the end of the video, while appearing to be entirely serious for the rest of it. Regardless, even if he had explicitly stated that in the first video, one of the first things that a professional YouTuber learns is that you can't expect your audience to know everything that's in your previous videos. If he's not actually trying to convince people of these conspiracy theories, but is instead just explaining what they are and why people believe them, without offering any significant counters for whatever reason, he needs to make that explicit in every video in the series, because there will be people, like me, who haven't watched them all and just see him uncritically presenting the pseudoscience as if it were credible. So let's take a look. But first, a word from our sponsor, Surfshark. Love is in the air. Valentine's Day is right around the corner. You and your special someone are curled up on the hotel bed, and you fire up that certain special website that you like to enjoy together, only to be greeted by an unfortunately fully clothed Cherry DeVille explaining why they no longer allow access from your location. Suddenly that remote ski resort in Montana doesn't seem quite so appealing. If only there were a way to change your device's virtual location to somewhere that wasn't blocked. Fear not, Montanaites, Montanians, Montana folk? And anyone else who wants to access a streaming services library from a different virtual location, either to gain access to begin with, or to access the library of content that they have for different locations. Surfshark VPN is here to save the day. Surfshark VPN is a virtual private network which swaps the IP address of your device with a new one, allowing you to be virtually located anywhere that they have a server. And Surfshark has over 3,200 servers in 100 countries, giving you plenty of locations to choose from. And as a nice little cherry on top, Surfshark VPN adds an extra layer of encryption between your devices and the internet, keeping you safe on public Wi-Fi and even stopping your own internet provider from snooping on you at home, keeping you anonymous and protected. Surfshark is easy to install with a few simple clicks and can be used on an unlimited number of devices with no extra fees and maximum compatibility, working on Windows, Macs, iOS, Android, and Linux. And with their 30-day money-back guarantee, you can try it completely risk-free today. Secure your privacy with Surfshark. Enter coupon code Rhino for an extra 3 months free at surfshark.deals/Rhino. Again, that's surfshark.deals/RHINO, and enter the promo code Rhino for an extra 3 months for free. This is a limited time offer, so sign up today. And remember, by signing up for Surfshark VPN, you're helping to support my channel, so thank you. Okay, instead of jumping right into his video... Shit. It's dry in the winter. I use the lotion is for my hands. The back of my hands get dry. Okay, instead of jumping into his video like I normally would, I'm coming back in to tell you that I think I found the video that gave people the impression that Greg promoting conspiracy theories was just him playing a character. Which, considering how important it would be to have that information, should at the very least be the first video in the playlist. But it's not. I had to go hunting for it. And when I found it, it still left me unimpressed. He complains that YouTube put a Wikipedia article under his video debunking the idea that Buzz Aldrin admitted that he never went to the moon, claiming that that was unfair despite the fact that he debunked it.
Like last year, they partnered with Wikipedia and created a new algorithm that automatically puts Wikipedia articles underneath conspiracy videos. I can tell you from my experience, that algorithm is completely broken. One time I made a video debunking claims that old man Buzz Aldrin accidentally told a young child that humans had never been to the moon. Anyways, they linked the Wikipedia article for the moon landing under my video, even though I defended it. End of story.
Never mind that at the end of that video, he gives a wink and a nod to the conspiracy theory potentially being legitimate.
And though people tend to have a really negative knee-jerk reaction to hearing somebody doesn't believe that we went to the moon, the truth is that there is reason to be skeptical that the official story is true or that we went at all. The United States had every reason to lie about it.
And for the record, YouTube just sticks those articles under any video dealing with a controversial subject like that. I have several under my vaccine videos. He seems to be defending his presentation of conspiracy theories with the idea that trying to hide an idea will make people think that there's something to it.
Hiding ideas gives them validity. Hiding ideas empowers those who believe in them, and it just forces them to go underground, where those ideas have the potential to actually radicalize and cause real harm. Keep bad ideas out in the open so everyone remembers why we abandoned them.
But at the same time, he dabbles in 9/11 trutherism, saying that he's not saying the conspiracy theory is true, he's just asking questions. A common conspiracy theorist defense.
The goddamned official report doesn't even mention Building 7. In fact, most people don't even know that 7 buildings were destroyed in New York that day. Plus, there was a collection of very specific investigation reports that were in all of the buildings that were destroyed in each attack. Was there a connection between the investigations and the attacks? What am I trying to say here? I don't know. I'm just asking the questions.
And the fact that he says Joe Rogan was so fucking cool for promoting the moon landing conspiracy theory, and that was one of his inspirations for starting his channel?
Closest thing we have to that now is Joe Rogan. And Joe used to be so f***ing cool. He was the guy who dared to question the moon landing. He might not have been an intellectual heavyweight, but he was on the edge. He was inspiration for all kinds of alternative media presenters like myself.
Doesn't bode well for the quality of his skepticism. He finishes that video with this.
We have to remember that not everyone who questions the mainstream narrative is a tinfoil hat wearer. So, in the spirit of entertaining alternative theories about the mainstream narrative, I've decided in the next couple months to unveil a new conspiracy theory that you've likely never heard of before. I know I do that a lot, but this time's gonna be a little different. This time, it's something that I'm uniquely qualified to dissect. It has to do with history. This time I'm gonna get hands-on, give it an honest and fair trial, and give you guys the role of being the debunker. Think of it as an exercise in your skepticism skills. It's like a game. It's gonna be a lot of fun.
So I guess that's where his defenders get the idea that he's just playing a character here, but given everything else we've seen in this video, and the one where he debunks the moon hoax before finishing off by lending credence to the idea that we never went to the moon, I'm gonna go ahead and say that Greg at least has the appearance of someone who doesn't believe we went to the moon, even if he won't just come out and say it. Also, just for shits and giggles, the reason he said he's uniquely qualified to dissect the conspiracy theory that he's going to present is because he used to drive a tour bus.
Straight out of high school, I ended up taking a summer job as a tour bus operator, and that was perfect because Kingston, my hometown, is actually a historic city with French settlers dating back to about 1673, and that helped me really carve my teeth on my knowledge from around that era to about 1850. And as my role as a tour operator, I ended up getting to access parts of the city that most people don't even know exist. It turns out that I am actually uniquely qualified to discuss the mud flood conspiracy theory because most of the structures they discuss date between the 16 and 1800s.
It's the mud flood conspiracy, the idea that an ancient massive empire was wiped out by a mud flood that left buildings partially buried, and we see evidence of this in modern cities that have buildings where part of the building was designed to be above ground, but is now below ground. All this to say that no, it doesn't look like he's playing a character and uncritically presenting conspiracy theories as a backwards way of combating them. It looks rather like he's peddling conspiracy theories, and anyone who doesn't go hunting through his back catalog to find this specific video of him explaining why he's peddling conspiracy theories will be left with the impression that he believes them, or at the very least takes them seriously. So when Greg says something in the video that I'm responding to, I'm gonna just go ahead and assume that he's presenting his actual position rather than playing a character, as that is what is apparently true.
NASA is not always honest to us. I've displayed skepticism about the moon landing a few times now. I don't know for sure if the moon landing really happened or if it was all a big lie. I'm not here to prove that either way.
See, this is what I mean. He's both sidesing it, but presenting it in a way that leans heavily into the conspiracy theory being his actual position. And given his history of casting doubt on the moon landing, which he is fully acknowledging here, I'm just going to go ahead and continue to believe that he accepts this conspiracy theory and is only paying lip service to skepticism when he very rarely provides evidence that would support the fact that we did go to the moon.
I'm not saying that NASA completely fakes their space program. I don't want to say that NASA lies about their capabilities in space. But a lot of the photos and videos that NASA and other space agencies have created over the years have been manipulated or manufactured in some way.
Oh, there he goes again. I don't want to say they're lying, but they're lying. As far as manipulated images are concerned, the only thing I can really think of that qualifies is when some images get touch-ups or are composite images to make them more aesthetic, like the Blue Marble image series, which consists of one unaltered photo from Apollo 17 and several images that were compiled from satellite imagery in the late 90s and early 2000s that flat earthers and moon hoaxers use as proof that NASA manipulates their images. Never mind the fact that NASA doesn't hide the fact that these images are not single-shot photos, but are stitched together using data collected by satellites over several months at least. It's a conspiracy.
In one of his books, Bill Clinton said that when the moon landing happened, a simple tradesman told him that he didn't believe that it was real because them fellers on the TV can make anything look real.
And this is indicative of the level of effort that Greg being Armoured Skeptic, has put into researching this video. He couldn't even be bothered learning that one of his books was his 2004 autobiography titled My Life.
Bill Clinton admitted after his time in the White House that perhaps that simple tradesman was ahead of his time. What do you think Bill Clinton meant by that?
Well, if we read the actual quote from his book, he says, "Back then, I thought he was a crank. During my 8 years in Washington, I saw some things on TV that made me wonder if he wasn't ahead of his time." What he appears to have meant by that is that TV special effects got a lot more realistic in between 1969 and 2001, which seems to be a relatively boring statement of fact, but unfortunately it was put in the context of an anecdote that lends itself to decontextualization for the purposes of promoting conspiracy theories.
But you have to remember that NASA has always been sketchy since the very beginning. NASA was literally founded by a Nazi, Wernher von Braun.
Oh, more laziness. NASA was founded in 1958. Eisenhower was president, T. Keith Glennon was the first NASA administrator, and Hugh Dryden was the first deputy administrator. So if anyone could be said to have founded it, it was those three. However, its roots go all the way back to the founding of the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics in 1915. The NACA transitioned into NASA in 1958, with Hugh Dryden moving from the director of the NACA to deputy administrator of NASA at its founding. Wernher von Braun was moved to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip in 1945, and while there is some doubt as to whether he was a Nazi out of agreement with their agenda, or whether it was just so that he could be allowed to continue his scientific work, as failure to join the party would have inhibited that, the fact is that he was, most definitely, a Nazi. That is not in dispute here, and I'm not even going to try and defend him for that. But he worked for the Army Ballistic Missile Agency until that agency was transferred into NASA in 1960, 2 years after NASA was founded. The three guys who could most said to have founded NASA, Eisenhower, Glennon, and Dryden, all served in various capacities in the American military during World War II, with Eisenhower literally being the supreme commander of the Allied forces, meaning that not only was he a general in the US military while they were fighting against the Nazis, but that he was the supreme commander of the combined forces of all the Allied nations and oversaw the final downfall of the Nazi regime. Whatever else you can say about the founding of NASA, the statement it was founded by Nazis cannot possibly be more wrong.
How do we know that NASA is not secretly designed to support their specific worldview?
Because if there is any one person who has the best claim to being the single person responsible for defeating the Nazis, it's the guy who commissioned the creation of NASA. Of course, crediting one person with the Nazis' defeat would be ridiculous, but it is undeniable that he played a very major role there.
I don't want to pretend to have all the answers here. I've never been to space. I'm not trying to convince you of anything specific. I just want to demonstrate that people have legitimate reason to be skeptical about what NASA is really doing in space.
And I just want to convince you that lying about who founded NASA in order to cast shade on them doesn't accomplish that goal, and in fact just serves to discredit you.
The NRO, or the National Reconnaissance Office, is in reality the United States Secret Space Agency. One of the functions for NASA is to run as a smokescreen for the NRO. NASA operations are often used as a cover-up for secret NRO missions.
Yeah, NASA and the NRO have teamed up at least a handful of times, but when making claims like that, you should back it up with, a source of some kind instead of just stating it as though it were fact. There are NRO missions that are publicly announced, and honestly, I don't think it would hinder them even if they were meant to be a secret, because how many people really take interest in every single satellite launch? Like, there are hundreds of orbital launches every year, and the media generally only makes a big deal about 2 or 3 of them. They could launch a spy satellite every single day, and people who don't live near the launch site would be none the wiser, even if they made every launch public. And actually, there are protocols, procedures, and laws in place, both national and international, that dictate that you can't really keep the launches a secret. The payload can be a secret, but launches are hard to hide even if it weren't illegal to do so. And really, if you want to demonize the NRO, just show a picture of the NROL-39 mission patch, where an octopus wraps the world in its tentacles above the slogan, "Nothing is beyond our reach." But yeah, all this to say that spy satellites are a thing that exist, but their launches aren't really a secret. It's their purpose and capabilities that are secret, and NASA has nothing to do with that.
If the NRO needs to launch a secret spy satellite, for example, well then NASA will get carted out into the media to spin some story about a weather satellite or something.
No, they just follow the protocol for launching anything into orbit and state that their payload is classified. They don't pretend it's something innocuous. Now, when we come back to his video, he will have just finished playing a bit of a Ronald Reagan speech that I'm skipping, where Reagan is talking about how an alien attack would unite the world as they face a common threat. He claims that the speech was referring to Reagan's Star Wars program, where a system of satellites was suggested that could destroy missiles launched from anywhere on the planet, but he doesn't play enough context to make that clear, and it really doesn't matter enough for me to bother watching a fucking Reagan speech.
There was never an outside force, obviously. All of this propaganda was spun up as a way to get people more on board with the idea of having missile launchers in orbit above their head, which is against international law, by the way.
The way he's saying that heavily implies that there are, in fact, missile launchers in orbit. This is false. There are no known weapon systems currently in orbit. There have been in the past, before the various treaties that outlaw it were signed, but these have since been decommissioned. Also, minor nitpick, but it's weapons of mass destruction that are illegal to have in orbit. Technically speaking, a weapon that relied on kinetic energy to do its damage would still be legal, but none of those are known to be in orbit either. And yeah, me saying that none are known to be in orbit does not preclude the idea that a system like that was launched at some point, possibly during the Cold War, and kept secret enough that the country that launched it got away without having to decommission it. But that's one of those burden of proof things that anyone with skeptic in their username should be familiar with. If you're claiming that there are weapons of some kind in orbit right now, you need to bring evidence to the table, and saying, "I'm just asking questions," is not evidence.
There's also the issue of how much money NASA is budgeted from the United States government. NASA costs the United States taxpayer $50 million per day.
Well, first off, the number you've got on screen is over 69 million per day, which is quite a bit more than 50 million. Minor nitpick, but not only would it have been easy for you to correct that in VoiceOver while you were editing, as you surely noticed the discrepancy since you presumably typed the number out yourself, but secondly, and more importantly, that amounts to 0.4% of the federal budget, a line item that is so minuscule by comparison that when you look at the federal agencies that got the biggest portions of the budget, it gets rolled into the category of independent agencies rather than getting its own spot on the graph. Yeah, to the average everyday person, that is a shitload of money. But when it comes to government spending, that's a tiny drop in the bucket. Thirdly, and most important of all, 69 is the funny sex number, and you squandered your opportunity to say, "nice," and have everyone go, "yeah, sex number."
So a lot of the media coming out of NASA exists simply to justify the horrendous amount of money that goes into the department.
I'd say that furthering our scientific understanding of the universe more than justifies that budget, but go ahead and shit on scientific discovery if you like.
Wouldn't it be funny if that money was being used for something else? Anyways, a lot of money is moving under the NASA name. In reality, NASA is just the face of America's various space programs and initiatives.
Kinda, I guess. They certainly are the agency that deals with space that gets the most press, but that's not inherently a bad thing, despite you saying it as though it is. And remember, the money that goes to NASA isn't pocketed by a few of the higher-ups who sit there sipping their scotch and smoking their cigars while laughing at how gullible we are. Go fucking rubes. Most of the money makes its way back into the hands of ordinary people who do things like work in manufacturing facilities. Hell, my brother got some of that sweet, sweet NASA cash when he worked for a company that made satellites, and I'd be willing to bet that a good chunk of my audience either have been themselves or know people that have been paid either directly or indirectly by NASA, whether that be for one of the flashier jobs like research and development, or something less flashy like being a contractor that comes in to fix their elevators or something.
NASA is like the PR department for America's science division, curating a specific perception of humanity's presence and capabilities in space.
Well, NASA, being an independent civilian organization with a goal of peaceful space exploration and scientific research, is a lot more inspiring to talk about than an organization dedicated to launching satellites purely to spy on enemy nations, so that makes perfect sense.
NASA is almost like a propaganda department designed to make it look like humanity is progressing scientifically and make it look like the United States is technologically superior.
Humanity is progressing scientifically. That is undeniable. And while its lead is not quite as substantial as it has been in the past, the US is probably the most technologically advanced nation on Earth, though depending on who you ask, Japan or South Korea could actually have taken that title from the US. It's a bit of a finicky measurement, as different nations will be more or less advanced than others in different areas, so you kind of have to weigh the different types of technology by how important you think they are, which is more than a little bit subjective. But also, one of the reasons the States is falling behind is because of the American proclivity for believing conspiracy theories like the moon hoax. It makes them less amenable to developing scientifically. Wait a minute, Greg's Canadian. Is this just like a ploy to set Americans behind so we can pass them? Maybe I should stop making this video now and just let it keep going.
But we now have SpaceX for that today, with Elon Musk taking the role of master of technology theater.
Is there still anyone left who takes Elon Musk seriously? Like, at this point in his career, it's pretty obvious that his successes have been largely due to him yelling out a bunch of crazy ideas and then paying actual smart people to figure out how to make them work, with the occasional one actually panning out, usually partially. Like, seriously, how many times has that dude accidentally reinvented the train to just be a worse version of trains that already exist?
The Starman launch gave us a spectacular view of the Earth from space. For those of us that watched it live, we saw that image of Earth in real time as the car floated off into space. It was a magical moment because humanity had never really seen an image like that before. And I got excited that SpaceX might actually show us some of that fun stuff that NASA was never really able to broadcast. Well, strangely enough, during a follow-up launch that was also being broadcast, they cut the live feed early before we got that beautiful, spectacular shot of the Earth from space. Apparently, because it's illegal to broadcast live footage of the Earth from space.
It's not, though. According to Article 6 of the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration of Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies, hell of a title that, which, for the record, is one of the treaties mentioned earlier that makes space-based WMDs illegal, quote, "States parties to the treaty shall bear international responsibility for national activities in outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, whether such activities are carried on by governmental agencies or by non-governmental entities, and for assuring that national activities are carried out in conformity with the provisions set forth in the present treaty. The activities of non-governmental entities in outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall require authorization and continuing supervision by the appropriate state party to the treaty." So it's not illegal to broadcast images of the Earth from space, as you probably could have figured out from the fact that they did it for the car launch. It just requires authorization, which for United States-based organizations comes in the form of a permit from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So when launching a car with a dummy in a spacesuit into space for a publicity stunt, it made sense for SpaceX to get the appropriate permits to get those nice glory shots. But for more run-of-the-mill launches, it doesn't really make sense to go through all that red tape for a permit when nobody's really going to be watching.
Why, in the name of all that is good and holy on this green Earth, would it be illegal to broadcast the world from space?
To prevent international incidents? To preserve national security? Those are the two main reasons I can think of. And if you take like 2 seconds to Google it, you can find a statement on the NOAA's website about the SpaceX Iridium 5 launch that ends with the sentence, "Conditions on Earth imaging to protect national security are common to all licenses for launches with on-orbit capabilities." So yeah, national security. Same reason Google Maps has to blur out a lot of military locations.
This footage is possibly the fakest official NASA film ever produced. There's an awkward moment where astronaut Ed White floats motionlessly out to the end of his tether, and right then, as he looks at the camera, he very clearly turns his entire helmet to salute. This is the first, last, and only time in history that an astronaut has been seen turning his helmet in space.
According to whomst exactly? Because after like a minute of searching, I found footage of Buzz Aldrin's Gemini 12 mission, which also clearly shows him turning his helmet during an EVA.
This should be impossible. Pressurized spacesuits are not designed to have articulating helmets.
The Apollo ones weren't, sure, but the G4C suit that was used for most of the Gemini missions had their helmet on bearings so that they could be rotated. And this was necessary because of how tight everything was around the astronaut's face. If the helmet didn't rotate, they wouldn't have been able to look around without turning their entire body Batman style.
And the astronaut's head is not usually fixed to the inside of the helmet to allow them to do this anyways.
Again, not on the spacesuits that weren't designed to have rotating helmets, but on the Gemini suits, they absolutely were.
But even if this suit was designed to allow the helmet to turn, the air pressure against the seals in the neck would create far too much friction to allow the helmet to turn.
Where are you pulling that from? It's bearings, man. Simple bearings. The locking ring had a rail that had bearings in it with an inner and outer rail. The helmet connected to the inner rail, allowing for an airtight seal that could still be rotated. This is basically the same design that is used on modern spacesuits to allow their wrists and torsos to rotate, and it's never been some top secret thing or an accidental blunder. From the 1966 NASA Technical Note on Spacesuit Development Status that explained past spacesuit designs and how they would need to be changed for future missions, quote, "The helmet-to-torso engagement was designed to permit the astronaut to connect the helmet to the torso without assistance in less than 5 seconds. The torso portion also connected to a rotating bearing, permitting the astronaut to turn his head with relative ease." This wasn't a whoopsie-doodle, this was a design feature of that particular suit. And the wrists had more of those same bearings, but you won't hear Greg complain about the impossibility of wrist motion in space for whatever reason.
When talking about another spacewalk with astronaut Michael Collins, NASA was caught faking imagery again when they re-released a photo of the astronaut that had already been previously published. Only this time, they blacked out the background and reversed the image.
Did they get caught re-releasing it, or did they do that thing that happens in the news all the time, where they'll use an already existing image to accompany a press release for an event that has no good photo? The spacewalk that Collins went on for Gemini 10 was cut short and not filmed due to the fact that they used twice as much fuel as expected by that point in the mission because of an error in their orbit that had to be corrected. So they plunked a photo of him training into the press material in order to provide something interesting to look at that was related to the mission. For more information on that photo and how you can find out that it was actually in the same photo book as the original unedited version, YouTuber Planarwalk, I don't know. They have a video on their channel telling you how to pronounce it, but my accent makes it hard. Anyway, they did an excellent video also covering this video of Armoured Skeptic. I made sure not to watch it until after I was done scripting it, but I did watch it before I recorded, so I know that they hit some stuff that I missed. So go ahead and check that out for more information. I'll leave a card in the corner and a link in the description.
The very first person in space was Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet cosmonaut. Pretty much all of the footage that we were shown of Yuri preparing to take off on his historic launch was clearly filmed on an earlier day as preparation. The cockpit shots, for example, are too well lit. The controls are not even operating, he's just flipping dead switches.
And if I grant all that, who cares? Sometimes liberties are taken with this kind of footage because, shocker, it's easier to get good-looking footage if you set things up for the camera rather than to be functional. So it makes perfect sense to set up a test run for one of the most important missions in human history with the cameras in mind, have it geared towards functionality for the actual event, and then splice the footage together to make it seem like it's all the same thing.
One time, George Bush Sr. was taking a tour around NASA, and near the beginning of the video, as they're walking through the ISS control center, you can see a feed on their screen that's supposed to be depicting an astronaut that is currently in space during the filming of this video. But for some reason, instead of showing him in the open hallways of the International Space Station, which astronauts usually have as their background in their videos, this footage shows a gridded blue screen like you would find in the background of a studio that uses special effects.
No, you wouldn't find a gridded blue screen in a special effects studio. You would find a plain blue screen. If they're doing motion tracking, you might find regularly spaced bits of high contrast tape to make motion tracking more easy, but it won't be a grid like that, and for one simple reason. It makes the process of keying it out significantly more difficult. Like here. I have the footage that was on the screen during the visit. It's actually super easy to find. It was an educational video for students using the microgravity environment of the ISS to give a demonstration of how centripetal force works. He spins a ball around on a string and shows that when he lets go, the ball travels straight in whatever direction it was headed at the exact moment that he let it go. The grid is useful for things like this because they know the dimensions of each cell on the grid, so when you record something in front of it, it makes measuring easier. If it were a blue screen, though, then it was a really bad idea to have white grid lines all over it, and an even worse idea to have the guy in front of it wearing a blue shirt. This is what it looks like when the blue is keyed out and replaced with yellow. And then this is what it looks like when the grayish-white grid lines are keyed out and replaced with that same yellow. Sure, this is something that could be cleaned up in post with some rotoscoping work, but why would they make it more difficult on themselves when they didn't have to?
I've seen endless footage coming from the International Space Station, and this time that Bush toured the ISS Control Center is the one and only time I've ever seen a CGI placeholder screen in the background of one of their shots.
It's not even the one and only time, because that's just flat out not what it is. But that grid is used all the damn time for mainly the production of educational videos. Here's one showing the physics of collisions.
A moving large mass hitting a stationary ball of the same mass.
Here's one taking advantage of microgravity to show a macro-scale demonstration of the kinetic theory of gas molecules.
Harmonic oscillators, whose frequencies depend on the masses of the atoms and the strength of the chemical bonds within the molecules.
Hell, they have a whole ass playlist of these physics demonstrations. I'll leave a card to that if you want to check it out. Once again, Greg loses to 2 seconds of Googling.
People have speculated that this is proof that NASA uses CGI and augmented reality to fake what happens on the International Space Station.
Well, my question here would be, why? Why would they do that? In 1995, the movie Apollo 13 was filmed on practical sets built on a parabolic plane. The only compositing they had to do was when the camera could see out the windows. The ISS was assembled in orbit beginning November of 1998, and blue screen technology in the 90s was, shall we say, less than perfect?
Gotta be kidding me.
So why would they not just build it as a set? Its cramped rooms and hallways would be just as easy to build on a plane as the Apollo 13 sets, so why would they do it the hard way?
Maybe the astronauts that were shown on television are simply actors, and what's actually happening on the International Space Station is something much more secretive.
Well, credit where it's due. At least he's not denying the very existence of the station that you can, literally see for yourself with your own eyes if you take a moment to look up when it will be overhead in your area and then, point a pair of binoculars at it when it's supposed to be there.
But people on the internet have been pointing out anomalies from International Space Station footage for like 15, 20 years already. I wanted to do a video years ago highlighting my favorite examples, but most of that footage has been wiped off of YouTube. It used to be so much easier to find stuff on this. So instead, I found a clip of an American bringing these points up on the record to demonstrate what I'm talking about.
I can find compilations of those clips very easily. Though I guess the problem is that the easiest way to find these clips is when they're contained within videos explaining how these are the result of things like video compression artifacts, as the video that's broadcast from the ISS is very heavily compressed in order to limit the amount of bandwidth required to broadcast it. Like, It's honestly pretty fucking wild that they even have an internet connection up there to begin with. If you want a more detailed explanation about how this works, as well as an example of compression artifacts in action, I'd highly recommend Marques Brownlee's video, "This is what happens when you re-upload a YouTube video 1,000 times." I'll leave a card to that, but to simplify it a bit, one of the ways that video files can be compressed to save on storage space, or bandwidth, is to retain the data from frame to frame for objects that don't move, so you only need data from objects that are in motion. But this process isn't perfect, and the more compression is applied, the more likely you are to get weird artifacts like moving objects appearing to trail across the screen.
Examples of this include astronauts fading in and out of the screen, green screen glitches, grabbing objects that aren't really there, pulling on invisible wires, getting tangled in their harnesses, and even astronauts appearing out of thin air.
And this, I think, is probably the best evidence in this video that Greg doesn't actually believe what he's saying and is attempting satire. You can't find these clips anymore, so I'll play a clip from a hearing and then overlay it with a bunch of the clips that I just said you can't find. But honestly, that's a level of stupidity that's entirely believable from conspiracy theorists. In my Just Look Up series responding to a Flat Earth documentary, there was a moment when the guy talking was saying how if you put a camera on a table in complete darkness and then shine a light on part of the table that the camera wasn't on, the camera would be able to see the lit up portion of the table, but not the light source. But in the video that they used as B-roll where they actually did that, the light source was very clearly visible. Literally as he was saying, you wouldn't be able to see it.
It seems to our mind that if you were on the other side of the table, you would see the light because it's, above the table. But that's not true, because on that part of the table, it's in darkness, meaning that the light isn't physically reaching that part of the tabletop.
So maybe this is Greg tipping his hand, maybe it's not. Arguably, the ease at which every single point he has made in this video could be debunked could be enough to show that he is being satirical, as he has in the past shown an ability to do deeper research than a basic Google. But he's also shown in the past that when he's responding to something he disagrees with, when the data's against him, he doesn't even bother with a basic Google search. Like, remember when H-Bomber Guy made a response video to Greg's video about the Bill Nye Saves the World show, where Greg states categorically that there is zero research on gender expression? So H-Bomber Guy played that clip along with a text scroll of a bunch of peer-reviewed research papers on gender expression and its relationship to gender identity and biology that were easy for him to find with some basic Googling.
Bill says science is the process we use to understand nature, but there is no science about gender expression, Bill. That was just fucking nonsense.
So I'm beginning to see why Skeptic had a problem with this episode. This episode would be really bad if it was based in absolutely no science, wouldn't it? Unfortunately, if you think that, I have some bad news for you. You might be wondering what these weird words and names and text scrolling past the screen are right now. These are just a short list of peer-reviewed papers and studies specifically into gender expression and the nature of its relation with gender identity and biology.
Now, in Greg's defense, he has since removed that video, so maybe he learned from H-Bomber Guy's critique and got better? But remember way back in the intro when I pointed out that one of the first things a YouTuber learns is that you can't assume that your audience knows everything that's in your back catalog? If this video actually is satire, he needs to do something to make sure that that is 100% crystal clear, preferably within the video itself, but even just saying so in the description or in a pinned comment would be better than nothing. Because what I see here is a guy that, the last thing I heard about him was that he got ripped to shreds by H-Bomber Guy for not even bothering to do a basic Google search in order to have an informed opinion on something, and now he's putting together a moon hoax conspiracy theory video that relies on him not even bothering to do a basic Google search in order to have an informed opinion on the matter. And if I weren't making a response video, there is no way I would have gone through his back catalog to find the one video that is in no way linked to his History is a Lie series, aside from having a pyramid on the thumbnail, where he sorta explains that maybe he doesn't actually believe this stuff. So I would have thought, oh man, he's gone way off the deep end, and then moved on. People who are prone to believing this nonsense, though, are more likely to watch and say, he actually has a point, and then start uncritically believing him, thinking that surely someone who calls himself a skeptic would have done the research to back up what they're saying. And given that a significant majority of his videos for the past year are all a part of this series, new viewers are increasingly likely to just see his uncritical conspiracy crap, rather than anything where he bothers to do any research whatsoever. And he's providing zero context about these videos being satire. If I were cynical, I might be tempted to point out that when he began this series, the views on his videos were falling from the hundreds of thousands into the tens of thousands, and this series stands out as an anomaly of videos from that time period that popped back up into the hundreds of thousands, and so insinuate that he might just be chasing a paycheck rather than caring about his own personal integrity. But of course, I'm nowhere near cynical enough to suggest something like that. No, sir.
Outside the International Space Station, during spacewalks, air bubbles have been recorded on numerous occasions. How is it possible for air bubbles to be present in the vacuum of space?
More to the point, how did you determine that those were, in fact, air bubbles, rather than debris, waste being jettisoned, or, as appears to be the case in at least one of the clips, thrusters firing?
I once questioned astronaut Scott Kelly about this phenomenon. His body language and answers only created more questions.
Well, body language isn't exactly something that I would consider good evidence for proving that someone is lying. There are many reasons why someone could have awkward body language but still be telling the truth. Like, for instance, if you are giving an educational presentation that also shares your experience living in space, and then some doofus gets on the mic during Q&A time and basically calls you a liar in front of the crowd. I wouldn't be comfortable in that scenario either, and would probably have handled it a lot worse than Scott Kelly did.
Now, what's really interesting is that they trained for spacewalks in an underwater pool with a complete ISS replica. Now, surely they aren't filming these spacewalks in an underwater pool and then editing them to appear if they're in space.
Yeah, surely they aren't. Training in water makes sense. It's the closest you can get to simulated microgravity without using a parabolic plane. But why would they design spacesuits to expel gas in the same way as scuba gear if they're trying to fake being in space? Surely sealing that off would be best, would it not?
How the hell did their film for their Hasselblad cameras survive traveling through the Van Allen belt?
Because the exposure to radiation was brief enough that most of the effects wouldn't have been noticeable on the film. There are some effects there, however. There's some white splotches in otherwise dark areas, and there's more graininess to the developed pictures than there would be if they had not passed through the Van Allen belts. But these effects are small enough that you really have to know what you're looking for in order to see them. Like, to give you an idea of how much radiation they were exposed to, if you get a dose of 100 to 200 rads of radiation over the course of a single day, you might start to show signs of acute radiation syndrome, but you'll probably be fine. NASA was measuring how much radiation the Apollo astronauts were exposed to, and it was always less than 2 rads over the course of their entire 5 to 12-day missions. And less than 2 is actually a bit exaggerated. The mission that got the highest dose was Apollo 14 at 1.14 rads. It's barely over 1. Granted, on the surface of the Earth, the average dose we get is less than 1 rad per year, so they got 1 year's worth of radiation over the course of a week or two, but that's the equivalent of getting 2 CT scans done in that same time period. Maybe it's a bit much, but it's hardly worth worrying about.
Look how good these photos are. The astronauts on the Apollo missions used large Hasselblad film to take these photos.
Okay, but just looking at the one picture he's got on screen right now, there are at least 3 spots in that picture that are white blotches in an area that should be black. That is possibly due to interaction with ionizing radiation. And with how blotchy the surface of the moon is in general, can you really say that there aren't more hidden in there?
The Van Allen belt should have been lethal to the astronauts themselves.
Actually, further study since the time of the Apollo missions has shown that the Van Allen belts are much less radioactive than previously thought. So, no.
I mentioned this in a previous video, and I said that NASA didn't know about the Van Allen belt yet.
Incorrect. The belts were hypothesized to exist by physicists in the first half of the 20th century, and they were directly measured by the satellites Sputnik 2, Explorer 1, and Explorer 3, all in 1958, nearly a decade before Apollo 1 was scheduled to launch.
They had theorized about the belt, but nobody had ever interacted with the Van Allen belt until Apollo 11 passed through it twice.
Once again, you're just getting basic shit wrong. Apollo 8 did it first.
And one time it kind of sounded like NASA almost admitted that they'd never sent humans through the Van Allen belt before.
Before we can send astronauts into space on Orion, we have to test all of its systems. We are headed 3,600 miles above Earth, 15 times higher from the planet than the International Space Station. As we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. But Orion has protection. Shielding will be put to the test as the vehicle cuts through the waves of radiation. Sensors aboard will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
I guess you missed the part where they aren't using the equipment from the Apollo missions? It's a new ship with new systems. Before plunking a bunch of people on the ship, they want to be sure that the radiation isn't going to mess with the ship's systems. As well as, like taking a bunch of readings that are a lot more detailed than was possible at the time of the Apollo missions.
My favorite anomalies come from video footage of the astronauts operating on the moon's surface itself, the best of which are examples of astronauts being caught on wires.
It looks like a pretty basic lens flare if you ask me. Light hits the antenna on top of the pack and flares in the lens. Sometimes a part of the flare shows up on the far edge of the image, as anyone who has even the most basic of photography experience will tell you is a very commonplace occurrence.
It's possible that that's a unique effect of that specific lens that they're using, but it's also possible that that light is revealing that those astronauts are hanging from a wire.
Not really, no. Why is it that you only ever see the lens flare at the edge of the screen at the same time as the lens flare reflecting off the antenna on the suit? Why is there never one at the edge of the screen by itself? Why does the middle of the wire never show up? In fact, it seems even stranger, given how light behaves, that you would only ever see the two ends of the wire illuminated together without any hint of anything in the middle. If it was because of the way the wire was moving, you'd expect the flare to travel up the wire as each segment was pulled through the angle that created the flare. But that's not what we see. We just see an ordinary run-of-the-mill lens flare.
One time, an old lady was arrested for trying to sell a moon rock that was gifted to her late husband by Neil Armstrong himself.
Well, she thinks it was given to him by Armstrong, but that remains unconfirmed. She was detained for 2 hours, during which time she was not allowed to use the bathroom, resulting in her wetting herself. Prosecutors declined to press charges, and later she sued NASA for unlawful search and seizure, which resulted in a $100,000 settlement for her. A follow-up lawsuit from Laura Murray Chico sought to establish the right of private citizens to own lunar material, as she has a vial of lunar regolith that was given to her father by Armstrong, along with a note and signature. The argument that NASA's Inspector General having people arrested for trying to sell moon rocks generally comes down to the idea that NASA's afraid to have independent labs test the moon rocks. But as part of the verification process of the follow-up lawsuit, the dust was tested by an independent lab and verified to be lunar regolith. And for the sake of closure, that lawsuit was dismissed, and the appeal of the dismissal was also dismissed. So as of now, it is unclear whether or not citizens are allowed to own lunar material. Chico was allowed to keep it, but apparently she should be worried that if she tries to sell it, she'll end up detained and humiliated. This isn't a story of NASA desperately trying to cover up the fact that we don't actually have moon rocks. This is a story of law enforcement being overeager. Stories like that are a dime a dozen. Like Nintendo, for instance, had police in Japan set up a sting operation in 1999 of a woman who drew erotic Pokémon art. She was detained for 22 days and fined for violating copyright law. That was a severe overreaction, completely unwarranted. But it doesn't mean that Nintendo was trying to hide something that the doujinshi artists had stumbled onto. It means that they are a shit company when it comes to being overprotective of their intellectual property.
Well, apparently it's illegal to sell moon rocks. Nobody knew this. Obviously, nobody knew this.
It's not so much that it's illegal to own or sell moon rocks. It's more that, as the rocks were obtained by government-run missions to the moon, the rocks are all the property of the government, and with very few exceptions, they have not given or sold any to private individuals. So any that are in the hands of a private individual who wasn't officially given one must, therefore, be stolen, according to their logic. So yeah, it's not that it's illegal to sell moon rocks specifically, it's that it's illegal to sell stolen property, and NASA just kind of assumes that any private individual selling a moon rock got it through theft.
A moon rock that was gifted to Holland by the Apollo astronauts was determined to be petrified wood.
It was not gifted to Holland by the Apollo astronauts. It was gifted to Willem Drees Jr., the former Prime Minister of Holland who had been out of office for 11 years at the time, by the US Ambassador to the Netherlands, J. William Middendorf II. This was during a visit by the Apollo 11 astronauts in 1969, but they weren't the ones who gave it to him. When Drees died in 1988, it was donated to a museum, which vetted the acquisition by calling NASA to confirm that it was, in fact, given to him. But the provenance of this rock is a bit tricky. While NASA did give lunar rocks to dozens of countries in the 1970s, experts cast doubt on the idea that any would have been given away in 1969. And when asked about it, Middendorf couldn't remember how his department came to have the rock in the first place. And given that there was a period of 19 years where it was in a private individual's hands before it was donated to a museum, it's not outside the realm of possibility that he got the moon rock mixed up with the petrified wood at some point in those 19 years, and so had labeled it wrong himself, leading to NASA confirming by phone call that he had received a rock, but because it was a phone call and not an in-person examination, they didn't confirm that the bit of petrified wood was what was given to him as a moon rock almost 2 decades earlier. So basically, we don't know where this bit of wood came from or how it came to be confused with a moon rock, but bureaucrats being mistaken about the origin of a rock is hardly evidence that casts doubts on the moon landing.
There was also some really funny lunar orbiter footage of the Apollo crew that can only be found in one documentary. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon. In this footage, it appears that the Apollo crew faked the size of the Earth from their perspective, making it look much smaller than it should, by putting a cover over their window, and instead of having the camera right up against the glass, while filming it, they had the camera on the opposite side of the pod. So it's possible that the Apollo 11 crew never left low Earth orbit.
And thus continues the trend of moon hoax believers just not knowing how cameras work, which honestly is most of where their ideas come from. Everything from the stars not being in the moon pictures to lens flares that they think are wires to this. There wasn't a cover on the window, the camera was up against the window. Then they zoomed out, making the Earth appear smaller. Then they physically moved the camera away from the window, which brought some of the cabin lights into view, but the exposure was set to capture the Earth, not the interior of their ship, so it still looked very dark. Then they opened up the aperture to properly expose the interior of the ship, causing the previously perfectly exposed Earth in the window to become an overexposed glare. And that's all there is to it. Also, this footage is relatively easy to find. It's not solely in the moon hoax documentary.
A really important point to bring up is that NASA lost all of the telemetry data from Apollo 11, meaning they have no record of the flight. The most important rocket launch in human history, and they lost all the telemetry data? Well, that's not all. They also lost all of the original film footage from the broadcast when they accidentally re-recorded over the tapes.
The way he's framing this, it makes it sound like the telemetry and video data were on separate tapes, and both were lost. This was not the case. It was one single combined tape. Also, the raw telemetry data may have been lost, but the decoded information is still available. As to the video, the raw footage had to be encoded in a format that would work with TV equipment of the time, and the way this was done degraded the quality. But you have to remember, this is 1969 we're talking about. They didn't have huge data centers with petabytes of 3.5-inch hard drive storage where they could keep every single scrap of recording. So when the receiving station in Australia confirmed that the original SSTV formatted broadcast had been successfully copied at NASA's American branch, they followed standard procedure and erased their backup copy for reuse, since magnetic tape is expensive. Then when the original footage was archived, it was marked as low priority for preservation because we already had copies of the telemetry data, and the video itself was one of the most recorded broadcasts of the decade. Nobody knows for sure what happened to the original tapes, but most likely is that the tapes containing the original footage were reused in the 1980s when NASA suffered a severe shortage of magnetic tape. But we also still have the original quality material from the rest of the Apollo missions. So while the loss of the Apollo 11 footage is regrettable, it doesn't even hint at the moon landing being a hoax.
The original crew of the first Apollo mission had their doubts about the possibility of their mission's success. The captain of the crew, Gus Grissom, even called the rocket a lemon. Gus Grissom hung a lemon from the door of the capsule and said that the rocket would never make it to the moon. Sadly, the original crew died when the capsule caught fire during a test.
And this is where, if this is satire, it crosses a line. If you don't believe what you're saying, but you're still willing to accuse NASA of killing its own astronauts for daring to doubt their abilities, then that's just gross.
Astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were chosen to replace the original crew.
You seem to be missing a few missions between Apollo 1 and Apollo 11 there, Sparky. Apollo 7 was the first crewed Apollo mission, and Aldrin, Armstrong, and Collins weren't on any of the Apollo missions leading up to Apollo 11. So they didn't just replace this crew of skeptical astronauts with more gullible ones, as you seem to be implying. Also worth mentioning is that Armstrong was handpicked to be the first man on the moon, even though it wasn't his turn in the rotation, specifically because he was the only astronaut in the program that didn't care if he was the first one on the moon. They wanted someone who wouldn't hesitate to abort if they had to make that call, and someone who really wanted to be first and knew that an abort would end that possibility for them probably wouldn't want to abort.
And Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were the very first men to ever walk on the moon. The very first try. No failed attempts. No mistakes.
Yeah, no, I guess people dying due to a mistake during a test doesn't count as a mistake, does it? Or the Gemini mission that I discussed earlier, where the spacewalk had to be cut short because they had severely overused their fuel? Or, hell, the fact that Apollo 11 overshot their landing site by 6 kilometers. Or the warning alarm that was falsely triggered while Armstrong was landing, prompting the guidance officer to have to do some on-the-fly telemetry analysis to determine whether or not an abort was necessary. Or the fact that they had to vent fuel gas after the landing because ice building up inside the line was causing the gas to accumulate near the still-hot engine, a situation that could have led to an explosion if not remedied. Or the fact that one of the astronauts in their bulky suits accidentally bumped into the lunar module arming switch and broke it off, potentially leaving them stranded on the surface until they ran out of air if they couldn't find a way to flip that switch, resulting in Aldrin MacGyvering a solution with the help of engineers at Mission Control involving using a pen to flip the switch. Yeah, whole thing went off completely without a hitch.
Every other Apollo mission succeeded, with astronauts walking on the moon. It's just mathematically very implausible.
So before y'all jump on him for not realizing that Apollo 13 was a thing that happened, I did skip him mentioning it. He's saying that all of the Apollo missions except 13 being successful is mathematically implausible. And since he's so confident in stating that it's mathematically implausible, I'm sure he'll have no problem showing the calculations he performed to come to that conclusion, right? No, of course he won't. He's at the same evidence level as young Earth creationists at this point.
Right after their return to Earth, the Apollo 11 crew looked totally disengaged and disinterested when giving a press conference about their trip to the moon. They should be excited.
That's not right after their mission. That's after they spent 21 days in quarantine. They were then trotted out to do this press conference before they were allowed to go home to see their families. 8 days in close quarters in space, followed by 21 days in quarantine, and then plunked in front of cameras. Of course they were low energy. I would be too. But if you look at the footage from right after they landed, they were elated, full of smiles, and even goofing off sometimes.
Frank Borman says you're a little younger by reason of having going into space. Is that right? Do you feel that way, a little younger?
We're a lot younger than Frank Borman.
Neil Armstrong always acted very evasive when asked questions about the moon landing. He never wanted to talk about it.
Yeah, so remember how I said he was picked specifically because he didn't care if he were the first? That's a part of his personality. It's not that he hated talking about the moon landing, it's that he hated public appearances in general. He wanted to get back to flying missions, but NASA wouldn't have it. They couldn't have their poster boy for the lunar program putting his life in danger, so he ended up as a desk jockey when he wasn't doing the public tours that he hated.
During one interview, when asked about a specific experience in space, Neil Armstrong allegedly jumped up out of his seat, ran out of the room, and began vomiting in the hallway. This could be a stress response, or it could suggest that the crew underwent some form of hypnosis or mind wipe after their mission.
Or, and hear me out on this, I know it's a wild idea, but he could have just been sick. Pretty sure that in my life, the vast majority of times that I have vomited, it has been due to illness rather than stress at being asked uncomfortable questions or hypnosis. I'd actually wager that that's the case for pretty much everyone in my audience. Also, that allegedly is doing quite a bit of heavy lifting there. If this were a real thing that happened as part of an interview process, you'd think that there would be documentation about it, but all that I'm finding about Armstrong and vomit are listicle articles pointing out that they left bags of poop on the moon, and a single Instagram comment saying that they also left 2 bags of vomit on the moon. I'm also not seeing anything backing up that Instagram comment. When talking about people being sick in space, Apollo 11 seems to have come out squeaky clean, with most people wanting to talk about the fact that the Apollo 8 astronauts spent most of their mission having to occasionally wrangle a free-floating bit of vomit or diarrhea from when Commander Borman got sick early on in the mission.
Since that first press conference, Neil Armstrong has never done one single on-camera interview. Ever.
You know, except for this one from 1969, this one from 1970, this one from 2005, this one from 2011, and probably a bunch more if I wanted to spend more than 10 seconds looking. And so again, we're left wondering, was this supposed to be a point that is so stupid and easily debunkable as to give away the game that this is satire? Or is this just Greg doing the same thing he did with the Bill Nye episode where he just assumes that he's correct and so doesn't even bother Googling to see if he's incorrect? I can't see inside his head, so since this all has the appearance of being serious, I will continue to assume that he's being serious.
Breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers.
Truth's protective layers? What the hell is that supposed to mean?
Well, given that the rest of the clip of that speech that you played and I skipped seemed to be in the context of encouraging young people to pursue scientific education, I'd say that that's a metaphor for uncovering the truths of the universe. Seems pretty straightforward if you ask me.
One time, Buzz Aldrin even punched a documentary filmmaker for making him swear to God that he walked on the moon.
Why don't you swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon? This is a hotel. We'll call the police. We pay. Come on in. We'll call the police. Why don't you swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon? You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, if I ever thought of it. Saying that misrepresented myself. Away from me. You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
Yes. One of the most satisfying videos on the internet. Yes, he punched a guy who had been harassing him for quite some time leading up to the punch, though the actual punch seems to be more in response to being called a coward and a liar rather than just being asked to swear on the Bible. Either way, this proves nothing other than Buzz got pushed past his ability to be patient at one point. And that's basically it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from H Bomber Guy, who says,
"Don't push it, Greg. You know for a fact that bow ties make anyone sexier, regardless of gender identity."
Indeed they do. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to go to surfshark.deal/Rhino to get 3 extra months for free. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I livestream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern, and with my partner every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Full Speed Retreat, and all the rest, who are the "I was just joking" defense against the accusation of spreading conspiracy theories that is my channel. If you'd like to be completely inadequate as an excuse for perpetuating misinformation, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! Pocketed by a few of the higher-ups who stir their scotch. They sip their scotch. I should know better than that, I drink scotch. Some basic Googling. "3M power strips just failed." There are 3M strips holding up my power thing just failed.
One time.
And this one time, at band camp, I stuck a flute in my pussy.